In the church that you grew up in,
Yes.
this church was built, I think, about 1878. But you weren't here in
No, I
1878.
was not, indeed.
No. But tell us just what pew you sat in, because in those days people sat in a particular pew.
Yes, and I see the numbers are still on the pews, even in 2011, where we are now. Pew 85 was right over there, and our family had that pew. It wasn't even big enough for our family, but I remember it very well. I was baptized in this church, actually, and the former minister, who was also here a long time, came out to our house one night and said directly to me, with my father and mother on the side, "George, you should become a member of the church." And that was the first mention of membership. And he set up a communicants class, and we had 5 meetings, and behold, I became a communicant of First Armagh. And I still come back here with great delight.
And it's always good to see you. And I suppose First Armagh has produced a lot of people who have moved. This is where they've started, but they've moved right throughout the world. And First Armagh is very proud that you became Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies at the Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg. And you've written various books. George, you've written another book. And what's the title of this latest book?
Well, the title of this latest book is Jesus and Paul Before Christianity. That's the main title. Subtitle, Their World and Work in Retrospect.
And what exactly do you mean by before Christianity?
Well, as we just mentioned, I'm a Christian. This church represents Christianity. Christianity is a world religion that came after Jesus and Paul. Now, the reason I draw attention to a study of Jesus and Paul before Christianity is that I, as a Christian, and you as a Christian minister, will certainly have all of that Christian heritage coming to bear on the reading of the texts of Jesus and Paul.
Yes.
So this book attempts, at least, to keep that in check so that we're not reading into the story, the history of Jesus and Paul, that which actually comes from a later time. And so much has come through the later time, tradition. This is not to say that tradition is a bad thing. I am as traditional as the next guy. But it must serve our purpose well. And the purpose of studying our 2 principal figures behind Christianity is to find out what were they up to in their time as persons of this planet where we live. That's what we're like.
Right. Now, I was fascinated when you talked about the geography of Jesus and Paul, and we think of Jesus of Nazareth and Paul of Tarsus, and you are George of Armagh.
That's right.
What part does geography play in the understanding of these 2 very prominent figures in the New Testament?
Well, geography has to do with place, especially, I suppose. You name places, and you name yourself, and you name yourself very much in connection with places. As you said, Paul of Tarsus, George of Armagh, and so on, and Jesus of Nazareth. But it's not just a matter of naming the place. Identity is formed in relation to place. Even language is related to place. So the location, not only in terms of finding your way to a place, or even living in a place, but location has a way of entering your very thought pattern. So we talk about the social location of thought. That's what I mean by geography. The geography of Jesus, the geography of Paul, are not identical with each other. So to study the role that place plays in self-identity is a very important study, it seems to me. Even language, as I said, is different. The language of Jesus is not the language of Paul, and so on. And the language of Jesus or Paul are not the same as our language right now.
Well, I think this is something we understand in Northern Ireland. My granny used to tell me that she lived about 10 miles from here, and people talked slightly differently with a different dialect.
Exactly.
From 10 miles away. So
that's right. Exactly.
We understand that use of language, and of course you do in Canada as well, with different languages used.
Of course. I mean, we have 2 official languages in Canada. And thought is always formed in relation to the language you use. For example, I've taught in a setting where there are many German people. German Mennonites, for example. And they'll be telling a story in English, and suddenly they'll say, "It doesn't sound right in English. If I could only tell it in Low German or something." Then you'd get the idea. See, language and culture and person and mind all work together. That's the idea of geography.
reading part of your book, you asked a question which I had never thought of, which is, did Paul know Jesus of Nazareth?
Well, now, we can't really answer that absolutely. There are very few things in history we can answer absolutely anyway, but that one we cannot answer absolutely. However, the evidence that we do have suggests strongly that Paul did not know Jesus, nor did Jesus know Paul, for that part, in terms of physical personalities and so on. There is no notion that Paul followed Jesus physically. He encountered Jesus after his earthly life.
What was the common ground between Jesus and Paul?
Well, I suppose one could say, well, he lived in the ancient world, he lived within the Roman Empire, he knew what occupation of various countries were. Paul's place was occupied, Jesus' place was occupied. Living under occupation is a situation that again forms personality and so on. But in addition to living in a world at large, he also lived within the smaller realm of what we call Judaism, and both of them lived within that religion, shared the central tenets of Judaism, which of course came through into later Christianity because we took over the Jewish Bible. And both Jesus and Paul had the same Bible and had the same religion.
What was the focus of Jesus' ministry in Palestine? It was a very agrarian, rural community.
Very much.
Maybe a bit like the community you grew up in
Could
Armagh.
very well be. Drumby more. I wasn't quite in the city, you see, but I at least came into the city. One of the interesting things about the material related to Jesus, which is very often the gospel simply, but there are other sources too that tell us something about where Jesus lived and what he did and so on. But the one thing we know is that Jesus of Galilee, like Nazareth was in Galilee, that rich area, and Galilee had not only the great waterway, the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River running right down through there, but it had cities. Tiberias, a very important city, Sepphoris, a very important city, both built by the great Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great. Well, you'd think Jesus would go into the city and start talking to people there, but there's not a word about Jesus entering the two principal cities of Galilee. One of them, Sepphoris, called the ornament of all Galilee. Well, Jesus somehow or other wasn't interested in the ornament. Instead of that, he was interested in peasants and widows and people who were sick and people who were in debt, and tells stories about the debtor and the tenants and the widows and all of that. It's part of his life. And for some of us, I include myself here, who's an academic, not too badly off, to actually relate to that Jesus is not easy. There's a bit of a challenge going on between us here. You know?
How does that compare with Paul's vision and work?
Well, that's an interesting one, because unlike Jesus of Nazareth, Paul of Tarsus and Damascus and Corinth and Athens and all the cities I'm naming here,
He travelled.
is really, he travelled, but he always travelled to cities. And that's where he sort of had his mission, not with the rural people. There's no mention at all of Paul sort of going to some peasant homestead and making friends there. He may have, but it didn't seem to be the focus of what he was about. And I think perhaps two things going on. First of all, he is an urban person himself. And he's interested now in getting this word out that has been given to him from the risen Lord, that this message that you've received from the Jewish Jesus, you yourself being Jewish, must also go beyond Judaism into the larger world, what we often call the Gentile world, the nations of the world. And Paul thought, I think the best way to get there quickly is to go to where the largest population exists. And thus he is in the cities.
And these were the big cities, the important cities.
Like the ones I mentioned, like Corinth was a very important city, from which we have at least 2 letters and probably some lost, as we know. Ephesus, very important city. Rome as well,
center of the
finally
empire,
ends up there, So very much an urban person. And the first believers in Jesus out there, out of Palestine, were urbanites, if we want to think of the term urban way back then.
Right. Did Paul abandon Judaism after his encounter with the resurrected Jesus? He came from Judaism, you've told us that, as Jesus did. But did he abandon it?
Well, now that is a good question, and it's one that has come to the fore recently and needs to be, I think, reconstituted and talked about more. Glad you asked that question. The notion is, from the Christian perspective, that Paul became a Christian. And when we use the term Christian even, we're using it in the sense of Christianity that we all know and love, see, which didn't exist.
It's a retrospective question.
That's right. So we asked about that conversion of Paul, and we'll talk about Paul's conversion. And very many people, for many years, as we know in the ministry, have written commentaries and books talking about Paul's conversion out of that bad Judaism, with all its legalism, into the good Christianity that we all know and love. The Christianity of John Calvin, of Martin Luther, and of Menno Simons, and others like that, who have sort of made Christianity as we know it, in Protestantism at least, what it is today. So that's our world. And to get behind that world and to start thinking the way Paul thought about his world is a difficult thing. I'm suggesting that Paul did not abandon Judaism at all. Sure, he had a new mission, and thus he is going to read his scriptures differently, think of the law differently, but to say that Paul abandoned Judaism is to say that he abandoned the law. And guess what? Paul says in very plain Greek and English, we uphold the law. Now, how can you possibly say he converted out of Judaism when he at the same time says, we uphold the law?
Would he have seen it as he fulfilled Judaism?
Well, he could say that, I think he could say and would say that Jesus, as the Christ of God, would be the fulfillment of Judaism. I think that's fair to say. But to say that it's a fulfillment of Judaism does not mean to say, and now Judaism has become suddenly bad, and Christianity that God has blessed so wonderfully through Constantine and all of those other greats to make it a great religion, must mean that Judaism therefore is rendered inoperative. I think Paul would be offended at that, personally. And I am too, by the way.
So who is the real founder of Christianity?
Well, it's actually hard to say. If you pin it down strictly to Jesus, and I think that's where one would be inclined to begin, if we're a Christian especially, you'd say, well, Jesus is obviously the founder of Christianity. But when you read the account of Jesus, there isn't any clear indication that he intended the great world religion of Christianity. Because when he talked about the kingdom of God, for example, he was talking very much about the inbreaking of this rule of God in people's lives to bring about deliverance, freedom from bondage, freedom from fear, freedom from debt, freedom from sin, you know. But that doesn't mean to say he was founding Christianity. And there is nothing to suggest that Jesus envisioned, or at least stated, that there will be one day a great world religion called Christianity. It just isn't there on the record. And besides that, Paul does not say that he is going to be the founder of Christianity. How do we know that? Because he says time is short, shorter now than when we first believed. And so he will say all kinds of things like that to indicate that he is thinking in eschatological terms, we would say. He's thinking of the end is near, the world is passing away, or this age is going to end soon. And he's not actually envisioning Christianity. So neither Jesus nor Paul should be considered the founder of Christianity in terms of their own intention, because their intention is not stated thus. It is our notion that they founded Christianity. But Christianity is a development out of what they were doing, to be sure. A development of, but not their intention. So we dare not put they were the founders according to their own terms.
In terms of somebody looking at the lives of Jesus and Paul and talking about place, you grew up in the agrarian rural background here, but you have lived in cities as well. And I suppose from where we're sitting, we think you're a person who can write with some authenticity about both those places. Have you found that?
I have, actually. And you should know, by the way, that Armagh is mentioned in a very distinguished way in the book. Even in line with Tarsus, said to be an important city. I actually make Armagh an important city. So you're right, I have both a rural community background. I grew up on a farm, but this was my church. So we drove from the farm to the church, and we did our business here in the Armagh. We bought our groceries here in Armagh. So I knew the city and I knew the country, and there's a sense in which you're right. I can relate in some measure to Jesus, who was very much in the peasant population, and Paul, who was a city dweller.
George, thank you very much for writing the book and for coming here today and choosing to record this in our church. Armagh is the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, which doesn't actually mean an awful lot to Presbyterians. But this is a church very worthy of a cathedral city, and this is a good place to do this interview, and we want to thank you for that. And we really want to wish you well with the book as you think about and others think about Jesus and Paul.